Well, our study today was a special request from somebody, and the title of it is How to Keep the Sabbath Day. Now, this study is not designed to convince anyone to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, but rather, if you see the need to keep the Sabbath day according to the fourth commandment, how do you go about it? Very practical things. How do we keep the Sabbath holy? And you know, this is just going to be the starting blocks. This is going to be the very basics. Because what I have found in my life and in my friends' lives, because I find a lot of things through you, we all have our different ways. And, you know, some things can be different and they can be special. But there are some things that the Bible tells us to do, and obviously we want to do those things that God asks us to do in His holy Word. I want to begin this study with Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, because there it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Folks, the fourth commandment says that we are to remember the Sabbath day to what? To keep it holy. Now, we could talk about the fact that this commandment begins with the word remember, and how almost the whole Christian world has forgotten the Sabbath. But again, I say that's not the purpose of our study today. I want to focus on the last phrase of that Bible verse. What does it say? To keep it holy. What is the end result, folks, of properly remembering the Sabbath day? It's keeping it holy, isn't it? So that indicates that the Sabbath is holy to begin with, doesn't it? And that takes us to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. There it says, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. So how did the Sabbath get holy in the first place?
God created it.
God blessed it, right? And sanctified it. And what does that word sanctify mean?
Set apart.
All right, to set it apart. Now this is really good. We usually, when we're talking about this, we're talking about our own sanctity, our own sanctification. But it's good to compare the two. What does it mean to sanctify? And the first definition is to set apart. What's the second definition of that word? To make it holy. All right? When God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, did He set it apart? I mean, that's the whole point, right? It's a day that's like none of the rest. So it is set apart. But did He make it holy? You know, obviously He did. It doesn't say exactly those words right here, but obviously this is what He did, because the commandment says, remember the Sabbath day to what? Keep it holy. So it had to be holy in the first place, didn't it? So the first point that I want to make in our study today is that God made the Sabbath holy. And only God can make something holy, right?
Amen.
Man cannot make anything holy. So any attempts to change or stop one thing and start another, any of that man-made stuff, is it holy? If God doesn't endorse it, folks, if God doesn't sanctify it, if God doesn't set it apart and make it holy, then it's not, is it?
Right.
It absolutely is not. But with God's very special help, can we be a part of keeping that day holy? That's the commandment, isn't it? And God wouldn't ask us to do something that we're not able to do. Now that takes me to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14. Hebrews 12:14 says, "Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord." Folks, there is a principle at work here. God is holy. Only God can decide what is and what is not holy, right? Only God can make it holy. This Bible verse says that without holiness, very simply put, we cannot see God, right? We will not see the Lord. And then in 1 Peter 1:16 it says it really plain. Because it is written, "Be ye holy." Why? For I am holy. Because God is holy, right? Ellen White said that we cannot keep the Sabbath holy unless we ourselves are holy. Right? There has to be the regeneration power in our life before we can keep the Sabbath holy. We have to have God's help, in other words. And that fits perfectly with what Jesus said. Didn't He say, "By their fruits you shall know them"? And didn't Jesus also say that you cannot get good fruit from an evil tree? Does that fit? Surely it does. You can't get a holy thing from an unholy thing. You're not going to get a holy Sabbath day from an unholy people. The next thing I want to point out here is that the Sabbath commandment is a testing commandment. Did you know that? It always has been a testing commandment. And as long as this world lasts, it always will be a testing commandment. Listen, before the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God on tables of stone, God used the fourth commandment to test His people. You read about that in Exodus chapter 16, and it's a really neat chapter. We all should be familiar with it, but I just want to read one verse right now. Verse 4 says, "Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day." Why did He do this? "That I may prove them." That word "prove" is another word for test, isn't it? So that I may test them or prove them. And what's He trying to test them about? Whether they will walk in His law or not. Whether they will walk in my law or no. Did the 10 Commandments exist before Mount Sinai?
Yes.
And the so-called giving of the 10 Commandments there? It's obvious that they did. After all, it says remember, doesn't it? When God gave them the manna in the wilderness, sometime before He gave them the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, He performed the miracle of the manna. And really there's two miracles concerned with this manna. Number one, that the manna would spoil every night, right? At least for 6 days. And then, equally as much a miracle that on the preparation day they were supposed to gather 2 amounts for 2 days, and it did not spoil overnight, did it? And He did all of this to test His people on whether they would keep His law or not. How did they do on that test?
Not too good.
They really didn't. The truth of the matter is, right there in Exodus 16, it says that some of them gathered too much on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, right? And what happened to it? Spoiled it. Bred worms, didn't it? And then some of them said, well, this is going so well. On Friday night, Or on Friday, they didn't gather a double portion. They said, oh, it'll be here tomorrow. But was it?
They went hungry.
No, they went hungry for a day, didn't they? And so, God even states it in that chapter. He's talking directly to Moses, but he says it just that way. He says, why won't you keep my 10 commandments? So they didn't do a very good job of it. And, as the story goes on, things got worse and worse, didn't they? But chapter 16 of Exodus shows us that the Sabbath was a test. In Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 12, it says, moreover also I gave them my Sabbaths. For what reason? He says, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. God gave it as a sign that He was their Redeemer, right? And their sanctifier. And people need to be sanctified just like the Sabbath was sanctified. The Sabbath would be like a picture of what's supposed to happen in our lives, wouldn't it? Are we supposed to be set apart? Are we supposed to be different from the world? A couple of places it's called out, right? We are supposed to be set apart. And what about holy? Are we supposed to be holy? So the Sabbath was actually given as a picture of our redemption, of what God is doing for us. So he says the Sabbath is a sign that you would know that I'm the one that sanctifies you. But it doesn't just go one way, does it? What does it say? He says, I gave the Sabbath to be a sign between me and them. To us here today, he says, I'm giving the Sabbath to be a sign between me and you. My part of the deal, God says, my part of the deal is, I sanctify you. What would our part of the deal be?
Keep it.
To keep that thing. And, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. Our keeping the Sabbath, does it let God know that we're on His side? That we're following Him? That He's our captain, our general, our president, however you want to look at it? He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, right? And we should choose His way. And the Sabbath is His way. Folks, think about it. The seal of God is the Sabbath. The mark of the beast, the counterfeit of that Sabbath, is Sunday observance. Right? Is the Sabbath a testing commandment in the last days? I mean, Ellen White wrote that would be the last great test, right? Verse 20 of that same Ezekiel says, and hallow my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. Now, we've been talking about this a lot lately. Dwelling with God is what it's all about. Him dwelling with us is what it's all about, right? And so think about it this way. The Sabbath is the sign that He is my God and that I am, from my standpoint, it's the sign that I am His people. What was it that God wanted? To be our God and for us to be His people. And the Bible says it many times over, doesn't it? And I just think it's really beautiful that we can see in this. This was His reason all through the Old Testament as well as all through the last day prophecies. The Sabbath is not just a sign between us and Him, though. The Sabbath is a sign to all the world that we are His faithful, commandment-keeping people. Right? I mean, how do we know who the remnant is in the last days? Those that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. Another place it says, have the faith of Jesus. But both times it says, them that keep the commandments of God, right? How many? All of them. I mean, if we were preaching an evangelistic series for folks that didn't know this stuff, that would be our main point to make right there, wouldn't it? Well, listen, all of them really brings, that picture I showed a minute ago with the glow around the Sabbath. It really brings that to mind, doesn't it? So let's look at some very practical information about the Sabbath. First off, which day is the Sabbath? Now, I'm not going to preach that sermon, but very simply put, verse 10 in Exodus chapter 20 says, the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. If you read the dictionary, if you read the encyclopedia, and we're almost getting to the place where you have to have an older one because things are getting changed. But folks, even the calendars are getting changed sometimes. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, the day that the world calls Saturday, right? And so on the calendar, when do we keep the Sabbath? The seventh day, the day the world calls Saturday. What about the time? What time do we keep Sabbath? Leviticus 23, verse 32. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls in the ninth day of the month at even, from even unto even. And that's talking about the Passover. But look at what it says. From even unto even shall you celebrate your Sabbath. In the Bible, time is reckoned from evening to evening. All through Genesis, during the creation story, it says the evening and the morning were first day, the second day, the third day, and so forth. So, from even to even shall you celebrate your Sabbath. What exactly does that mean? Mark 1:32. And at even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased and them that were possessed with devils. So the Bible lets us know when even is. It's like our word evening, and yet it is the point that the sun sets. There is a point every day that we can look to when the sun has completely set, right? And that's really what it's talking about. Because today we commonly say that evening is about 3 hours of our day, right? And so you can't just pick any of those times. When is the even, according to the Bible? It's when the sun sets. And Mark makes that very plain here. When the sun sets, in other words, when it goes down over the horizon. And then back to Leviticus 23, the first few verses are talking about the Sabbath, and then it talks about the other feast days. But it says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now that word Sabbath literally means to rest. That is the literal meaning of the word. And it comes all the way from the creation story. God created the earth in 6 days, and then he rested the seventh day. And so this resting is really what the Sabbath is mostly all about, at least in a literal sense. The commandment says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son nor thy daughter, thy manservant nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now that's a very strict statement about no work being done. There's a lot more to it than just the fact of not doing work, but that is the basis of the Sabbath. It is a day of rest. Those yearly Sabbaths that it goes on to talk about in Leviticus chapter 23, we don't practice those anymore, but it was truly about the rest, wasn't it? That was still the point to it all. It was harvest rest. It was a little different, but it's still, the rest is the main thing. And so I want to go now to Hebrews chapter 4 and look at a few verses about resting. It's one thing to not work. It's another thing to rest. In one, we're not doing something. In one, we are proactively doing something, aren't we? Well, that sounds funny because rest would be the opposite of doing something, wouldn't it? Well, that's interesting. Well, let's go and see what the Bible says. Verse 1, "Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left of us entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." This is like he's saying, beware. Let us fear, lest we come short of this rest that he's talking about. Verse 4, "For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works." Now that lets us know that in Hebrews chapter 4, are we talking about the fourth commandment? Are we talking about the Sabbath day of rest that was begun at the creation of the world? And yes, we absolutely are talking about that. You will hear people today who will say, well, Jesus quoted all of the other 9 commandments, but he did not quote the fourth commandment. And that's not at all true. Not going to go through a bunch of that, but the long and the short of that statement is this, that he did teach in his New Testament all 10 of the 10 commandments. And he was perfectly consistent in how he did that. And what I mean by that, all of the last 6 commandments are quoted verbatim in the New Testament. Just exactly how they are quoted in Exodus chapter 20. Not one of the first 4 commandments are quoted verbatim. Not even close. In other words, I'm not saying one word was left out or something like that. Not even close. All 4 of the first 4 commandments are in the New Testament, but they're done in precept, we would say. They're not done word for word the way they are in the Old Testament. But all 6 of the last ones are. And so, if you're going to throw out the fourth commandment because it's not quoted verbatim, you would have to throw out the first commandment, the second commandment, and the third commandment. They're not quoted verbatim like the last 6 are. I think that's just really profound. But Hebrews chapter 4 is talking about the Sabbath, right? So was the Sabbath left out of the New Testament altogether? Absolutely not. There's more than just this. But if you had nothing else, Hebrews 4 should be enough to show us that. And we'll read some neat verses as we go through this. "But he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, that God did rest the seventh day from all his works." Now I will tell you this, that I believe Hebrews 4 is using the Sabbath as a physical or a literal illustration to help us learn something spiritually. Because the Bible does that over and over, doesn't it? Doesn't the Bible say something that can be taken literal and then it makes an illustration out of it to teach us a spiritual lesson? Just almost all of the Bible is doing that. And I believe that's what's happening with Hebrews chapter 4. There's something more than just the commandment that is at stake in Hebrews chapter 4. But verse 5 says, "And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, And they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Now what the Apostle Paul is saying here is that there are some that have not yet entered that need to enter into God's rest. Okay? But there were also, it says, they to whom it was first preached. Who would that be? That'd be the children of Israel, right? Some of them entered not in because of unbelief. It's sad to say, but I would say the vast majority of them did not enter into the kind of rest that we're talking about here. But let's read on. Verse 8 says, "For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day?" In other words, if Jesus would have changed the Sabbath to Sunday or any other day, wouldn't he have told us? Would he make us mystically have to figure something out, or would he plainly tell us what he wanted us to do? I mean, God gives great details all through the Scriptures on what he would have us to do. And so the conclusion to these verses so far is verse 9. "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." What is that rest?
Sabbath.
It's the Sabbath. It's the Sabbath of the fourth commandment. In fact, in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus is prophesying about the last days and the end of the world, he says that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and the temple's going to be destroyed. And he says, "Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." So Jesus is looking down in time about 40 years when it actually happens. Did he expect his Christian, not Jew, but Christian people to be keeping the Sabbath? He absolutely did. And so, Hebrews 4, verse 11 then, says this, and I think this is one of the most amazing statements. It says, "Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest." That is a play on words, and I've said it, I've said it for many years. There are lots of play on words situations in the Bible. Okay? I think they're there because they're clever and they make us think. But it's saying, in a very unique way, let us labor to enter into rest. Well, how can you work harder to rest better? That's a play on words. It's kind of an odd thing to say. But could it also indicate that the Sabbath rest is not the only rest that he's talking about here? Okay? There is a commandment and there's a set of rules. There's some do's and there's some do-nots that the Bible gives us about the Sabbath day. But I believe from the bottom of my heart that what it is saying here is that the physical rules that we keep about resting have an even greater spiritual lesson to teach us all about our relationship to God, our relationship with God. And of course, I haven't read it, but the last part says, "Lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief," talking about the children of Israel, right? All right, now, verse 12, let me say it this way. From there to the end of the chapter, there are some absolutely great and awesome Bible verses that you guys could almost, probably all of us, quote by heart, that are in the rest of this chapter. And I just want to share some of them with you. Actually, I'm going to wind up sharing them all with you. I picked one to put on the screen. But verse 12 is that Bible verse that says the Word of God is quick, means alive, and it's powerful, and it's sharper than any two-edged sword. That's an awesome Bible verse. Amen? Verse 15 is that Bible verse that says, For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Boy, that's an awesome Bible verse. And it's in Hebrews chapter 4. These are Bible verses that we use to have Bible studies on a myriad of different subjects, right? And where are they contextually? They're in Hebrews 4. The chapter about the Sabbath, right? And entering into God's rest. Now, see, I think it has more, it's more than just the Sabbath. 16, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Another awesome Bible verse. But it's verse 14 that I want to show you today. Verse 14, seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Folks, if you put it in context, what are we talking about in Hebrews chapter 4? The Sabbath and entering into His rest, which I think is talking about the relationship with God. Okay? And the Sabbath is a big, giant leap in going there, but you know, the Pharisees kept the Sabbath to the letter of the law, right? Didn't have the relationship, did they? So we don't want to be that, do we? We don't want to be just another Sabbath-keeping people. There's something special about all of this. Well, putting it in context, if Hebrews chapter 4 is about the Sabbath, and he says that some of you still need to enter into this rest that I'm talking about, right? And he says the children of Israel, the ones that first knew about all of this, did not, many of them did not enter into this rest, right? And so now he's talking about high priest and how Jesus was tempted but overcame. And he says, let us hold fast our profession. And the sad thing is, in our churches, many of us have become very sloppy. And people might say, oh, the sun is going down. But I've still got a few more dishes to do. That won't matter. And if you can accept that way of thinking, let's take it a step further. I'm on the lawnmower and I'm mowing the yard. Well, that sounds unthinkable, I know, but hey, just got a couple more rounds. It's not a big deal, right? I'll go ahead and finish. It's not that big a deal, right? John Wesley told the story about a man who was polishing his shoes. Now, I understand that John Wesley was talking about Sunday when he said Sabbath. But so was Fanny Crosby, that song that we just sang, right? But John Wesley told the story about this man that was polishing his shoes, and it took him about 15 minutes for each shoe. And as he's finishing up the first of those two shoes, he realizes that the sun is right now setting. And so the next day he goes to church and he's got one polished shoe and he's got one scuffed up shoe. And I think most of us would look at that story and think, you know, is it really that big of a deal? But I'll tell you, I have to really appreciate that this is somebody that stands for principle. And Ron, you were talking about that just a few minutes ago. And we have a bumper sticker like saying that goes with this: if you won't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, right? And it's true. That's so very true. So, is it a big deal that I'm still going through the yard after the sun has gone down with the lawnmower? Well, tell you what could happen. The neighbor could drive by and see that the sun is down and you're still mowing. Now, in parentheses in my notes, I've got God sees everything. Right? I mean, our first thought shouldn't be that somebody's going to see us doing something wrong. We ought to be cognizant of the fact that God sees everything. And He's the one I really don't want to offend. But just to help us reason through this, your neighbor drives by, he sees the sun is down, and you're still mowing. Now, he's not a Sabbath keeper. But what has happened?
Neither are you.
What? Good point. What message are we sending to our family, to our neighborhood? You know, things get sticky in some of the situations. We cannot force our family and our friends to see the truth, to love the truth, or to live the truth. But we can give them a good example to follow, can't we?
Brother's keeper.
Brother's keeper, that's right. I tell you, there's so many times when we come to church and we pray for our relatives, for our children, and we don't realize that if we break the Sabbath ourselves, I'm just going to be real with you. It's like everything else. I'm not the police. You can do with it as you will. But I'm telling you, if we don't come to church so we can go to the birthday party, what are we telling our family? Are we teaching them that the Sabbath is more important or the birthday party is more important? And I mean, I would submit to you that we all do these kind of things, and I think a lot of the times we probably don't think through it. You know, we're probably a little oblivious. But that's the reason we study our Bibles, right? Is to get unoblivious. Think about this. Think about this. In your mind, the devil is telling you it's not that big a deal. But in that neighbor's mind that just caught you cutting grass on the Sabbath, what is the devil saying to him about you and about commandment keeping? He says it's not that big a deal to me, but when they see me do it, he's whispering in their ear, you see that hypocrite over there? But I'll guarantee you, he's over there stirring up the best he can, right? He's doing the most damage that he possibly can. It's part of Satan's game to highlight our inconsistencies and to erode our commitment. And sometimes we're willing participants in all of that. This is a neat Bible verse that I just want to balance this out with. Jesus said, and he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, the reason I wanted to put this Bible verse right here is because I think Sabbath keeping takes balance. Balance doesn't come natural, does it? We're given to extremes. We're given to making those mistakes. We'll go too far in one direction, or we'll go too far in the other direction. There is a time, like the Pharisees were accusing Jesus of breaking the Sabbath when he was healing somebody on the Sabbath day, or when they plucked the ears of corn and ate the ears of corn. Is there anything wrong with plucking a fruit off the tree to eat right there at the moment? No, there's nothing wrong with that. So in their minds, you're either on the tractor bringing in your crops, and there's no difference from that than plucking a fruit off the tree and eating the tree. You know, that's the extremes that I'm talking about. But what is your attitude? Does God want us to dread the Sabbath? Does He want the Sabbath to be no fun? Does He want the Sabbath to be boring? And I'm going to tell you, I've had times in my life when the Sabbath wasn't any fun for me, and when the Sabbath was boring for me. Okay? But we're going to talk about that. The next slide, folks, if we will do what God asks us to do, will He perform a miracle for us, no matter what subject we're talking about?
Amen.
If we follow His way, He will bless us and He will perform miracles, if need be, for us. Folks, God does not want us to dread the Sabbath day. He wants it to be a blessing. But folks, if we don't have a love relationship with Jesus, we're going to be sitting there watching the clock, wanting it to be over with. And you know, I'm telling you, I believe I was in love with Jesus. I wasn't educated very well. And I came into this church and I was brand new to all of this stuff, and they told me to keep the Sabbath and didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have benefit of much of an education on this. But here's what I want to share with you, and I want to testify too. Isaiah 58 says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, and that means take your dirty foot off of the Sabbath. Do you know what that means symbolically?
Don't violate the Sabbath.
If you put your foot on something and
You're muddying
you're muddying
up the Sabbath.
it up, you're profaning it, however you want to look at it. But he says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day. Keeping the Sabbath holy is all about remembering it's God's day and acting accordingly, right? Doing what He says to do and not what He says not to do. That's right. But he says, call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shalt honor Him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. And here's my testimony. I called the Sabbath a delight for a good while before it was. But isn't that what it says? Doesn't it say, I want you to call the Sabbath a delight? Look at the next verse. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Folks, attitude is everything. Attitude is everything. This is not about trying to get you to do something that you don't want to do. Not by me, and I don't believe it is by God either. It is all about, if we truly love Him, we're going to keep His commandments. If we truly love Him, we are going to want to please Him, right? If we truly love Him, we want to think like He thinks, and we're going to want to act like He acts. This Bible verse tells us plainly that if we call the Sabbath a delight, He will then make it a delight. All right? He'll change the way we see things, I promise you. If we do anything God's way instead of our old, habitual, worldly way, He will change our minds about it. He'll work a miracle for every single one of us. He will make it a delight, but notice we're not just delighting in the Sabbath. And I'm telling you, the Sabbath has become a delight for me. But it says you will delight yourself in what? In the Lord Himself, right? Now, Exodus chapter 16 and verse 5. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now, we've already talked about that. So why do I have that Bible verse back up there, or this Bible verse up there? It's because it talks about another special day. Not just the Sabbath day, there's another special day of the week. Because if you look at the days of the week, you got God's way of expressing it in the Bible, and you got Satan's way of expressing it through paganism. And unfortunately, we've been brainwashed to think that's the way it really is. And I wish we could erase the terminology as well as everything that goes with it. But it's Sunday, the sun's day, Monday, the moon's day, Tyr's day, Woden's day, Thor's day, Freya's day, Saturn's day. But in the Bible, is there Sunday? Is there Monday? You have the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. And the sixth day is also called the preparation day. And then you have the Sabbath day. So there's only 2 days of the week that are named, and both have to do with keeping the Sabbath, don't they? Of course, the Sabbath day, but that sixth day is named the preparation day. Is there some preparation needed if we're going to successfully keep the Sabbath day?
You bet.
Absolutely there is. Exodus 16:23, he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that you will bake today, and seethe that you will seethe. And that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. The preparation is very, very important. There's going to be certain times that you can't do the Sabbath without the preparation, right? And you ladies especially know that this is true. And then there's Nehemiah 13. And this is another chapter that needs to be studied, but we don't have time for that today, so I'm just going to read a few verses. Nehemiah 13:15. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. What is victuals? Very simply put, it's food. And they were selling food. Why do I say that? Why do I bring that up? What's that got to do? There's an awful lot here. You think about that. Going out to restaurants on the Sabbath day. You think God had that covered in the Bible? I think He absolutely did. Yeah, and it would be the same for grocery shopping, wouldn't it? And that's my field of expertise, but not on Sabbath. Verse 17, Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said unto them, and who is Judah? Who's the nobles of Judah? That's the leadership of God's people, right? What evil thing is this that you do and profane the Sabbath? Nehemiah was a prophet of God that he raised up to deal with this very situation. Verse 19, It came to pass when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates that there should be no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So they got very serious about this. This was a time when the nation was in apostasy and God raised up a prophet, and there was a reform. There was a reformation that was going on in the nation of Israel. And it was so bad, He told them the first time. The second time, He not only told them, but He put guards at the gate. You are not going to do this thing. Verse 20 says, So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. So He will not let them in the city to do their business. And what are they doing? They're camped outside the gate.
Like Black Friday.
Look, yeah, watch it. Yeah, like Black Friday. That's a good point. But we were talking a minute ago about watching our watches, right? Watching the clock. And so that's exactly what was going on here. Now, a lot of these people were not Sabbath keepers. They were traveling salesmen coming in to do their wares. I'm not saying they all were, but here they are, lodged right outside the gate. And then this is very interesting. Verse 21. Nehemiah says, Then I testified against them and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. Now, that's not normally the way we would handle things, and I understand that. But was it time for that?
He was setting the precedent.
I mean, obviously he did something that changed things for the good, didn't he? Now, some people will say, well, we have to eat on the Sabbath. And folks, that's the reason why we have a fellowship meal every week. We don't just do it once a month like a lot of churches. We do it every week. And the reason for that is we have always at this little church had people that drove great distances to get here. You bring them here at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. You keep them here till 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and then they've got to drive an hour or more. We don't want to put that burden on anybody, and we certainly don't want to put that temptation on anybody. Yes, we do have to eat on Sabbath. Actually, no, we could fast. We do have to drive our car to get to church. Just like we have to wear clothes when we come to church, and that is a hard, fast rule we have here. Do we buy our gas on the way to church? Do we buy our clothes on the way to church? Should we buy our food on the way to church or on the way home? You know, God gave us 6 other days to get our business done, didn't He? And He especially gave us a preparation to get everything done before the Sabbath so that we wouldn't have these issues. Most of our people would agree that it would be a sin to go to the store and buy all the individual ingredients for our lunch on the Sabbath, on Sabbath. So what's the difference in that and going to a restaurant? But you know what, folks? And forgive me, I'm just going to be real. We see indications from time to time of folks that come, and we want you to come. We love you. We miss you when you're not here. From the bottom of my heart, we want you to come. But folks, if you don't bring food with you, you can stay and eat our food. Okay? It's been done before. Trust me. But it breaks my heart to see somebody who has not made preparation and who feels like they can't eat without bringing something, and they stop by the store to get something on the way. And I'm sorry, but that's obvious sometimes that that's what has happened. That just makes me so sad when I see that. I can't imagine how God feels about that. There's 6 other days to make our preparation, isn't there? Isn't there?
Yes. Amen.
I mean, do we need to make our preparation on the preparation day, or don't we?
Amen.
Matthew 12:12 says, How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Again, I want to balance out what we're saying. This is not all about, getting you to do something that you don't want to do on the Sabbath day. And folks, there are times when somebody gets sick and they need to go to the hospital. And, you know, you didn't want to do what you did, but what do? You got to take care of business, okay? We've all been through that. You shouldn't feel bad because we've all done it, okay? There's a time when that's what you need to be doing, all right? If there's an emergency, God wants you to help, right?
Amen.
That's right. But that's the exception, not the norm.
But it's the exception, not the norm, not the rule. That's exactly right. Luke 14, verse 5. Jesus answered them, saying, "Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fall into a pit, and not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day?" He said that in response to the Pharisees accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. Right? Leviticus 23 and verse 3. We've already read this one, so I'll skip through to the part that I want to focus on right now. It says, 6 days shall work be done. The seventh day is the Sabbath of rest. It's what? An holy convocation. So there's the thing about work. And we didn't say a lot about that because that's really the basis of the Sabbath. We're supposed to rest. We're not supposed to work. And I don't think you have to be brain surgeons or rocket scientists to figure that out. Right? But it's also said to be an holy convocation. What is a convocation? Well, if you look it up in the Strong's Concordance, which is the best tool that we have to use, it says something called out. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? A convocation, and holy convocation, is defined as something called out. What else is called out? The Sabbath. That's what it is. It's a holy convocation. It's set apart, right? It's called out, something called out. And so what else is called out? We are. Okay? And this is great because the two go together. And Strong's also says that is a public meeting. So what do we get from that? It's a holy convocation.
Special public meeting.
What shall we do or not do on the Sabbath?
Together in church.
Is church optional?
Forsaken is some years.
I'll shut up. I don't think it's optional. I think it's the habit that God's people ought to be in. I know that there's times when you're tied. Your hands are tied. But I also know that 99.9% of the excuses I hear for not coming to church
Too hot, too cold.
are not tied. Yeah, that's right. Excuses. That's right.
Or kids' nose.
That's right. All right, Hebrews 10:25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as a manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. What is that saying to us?
It's more important because we're getting closer to Jesus' coming.
Every day we're getting closer to the end of the world, right? So every day, the reason why you should go to church every Sabbath goes up. Actually, it's gone through the roof by now. Amen? Very, very important. All right. I want to share with you. I'm showing constraint. I picked 5 Spirit of Prophecy quotations to share with you. And they're all short, like this one. We should jealously guard the edges of the Sabbath. Remember that every moment is consecrated holy time. Keeping the Sabbath means keeping 24 hours, right? Give or take a second or few, right? Because mathematically, it is growing during one part of the year and it's waning at another part of the year. Because every day it gets, it's a very small amount, but it is true. Jealously guard the edges of the Sabbath. How do we do that? What is that talking about?
Had to be ready before.
Yeah.
Well before.
turn off the lawnmower when the sun goes down.
Yeah, it shouldn't be 3 laps after the sun goes down, should it? Maybe it ought to be a few laps before the sun goes down.
I haven't seen it, but I understand that the shopkeepers in Jerusalem today, I don't know about back then, but today, they're sitting there looking at their watch, and then as soon as it hits that second, they run and unlock the door.
Right. Right. That's not guarding the edges, is it? That is definitely not guarding, or it's not guarding it for God's sake. It's guarding it the other way, maybe.
But I've heard it said too that like at noon on Friday they were all shutting down. Probably in days gone by.
Yeah.
So you're ready, you know.
And that's something about this. Before the Sabbath begins, the mind as well as the body should be withdrawn from worldly business. Listen, what good's it going to do you to keep the Sabbath if you're thinking about that instead of thinking about God? I mean, that would be wrong, right? It says we should each Sabbath reckon with our souls to see whether the week that has ended has brought spiritual gain or loss. You see the ellipsis, I cut some out for space and for time, but she actually said wherever possible that the people ought to be given the day off after lunch on Friday. While preparation for the Sabbath is to be made all through the week, Friday is to be the special preparation day. What do we learn from that?
You can go shopping on Thursday.
You can go shopping on Thursday, but really and truly what it's saying is we should be thinking about the Sabbath experience all week long.
Should be very
You know, there are things that need to be prepared for Sabbath that can't happen in one day's time. So it's impossible to make those preparations just on the preparation day, right?
That's right.
Check this out. For far more sacredness is attached to the Sabbath than is given it by many professed Sabbath keepers. The Lord has been greatly dishonored by those who have not kept the Sabbath according to the commandment, either in the letter or in the spirit. He calls for a reform in the observance of the Sabbath. He calls for reformation. Do we need reformation today? I heard it said not long ago this subject came up, and someone said to me, I'm absolutely sure all of us could stand to improve. Right? Last one. Let not the precious hours of the Sabbath be wasted in bed. Now,
No late activities.
really and truly, that's not what this is talking about.
Okay.
I used to kind of scorn at people that would, be anxious to leave church so they could go home and take their naps on the afternoon. I actually had been the lay activities leader for a number of years. But having said that, this is actually not talking about an afternoon nap. Look what it says. On Sabbath morning, the family should be astir early. So it's not talking about an afternoon nap. What's it talking about?
Getting up for church.
Getting up at a decent time on Sabbath morning. If they rise late, there is confusion and bustle in preparing for breakfast and Sabbath school. There is hurrying, jostling, and impatience. Thus, unholy feelings come into the home. The Sabbath, thus desecrated, becomes a weariness, and its coming is dreaded rather than loved. Everything we do ought to make the Sabbath be a delight. Right? Do we have some control over that?
Yes.
I mean, we have the main control over that, don't we? But Amos 8:5, saying, when will the new moon be gone that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small, and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit. You will notice here that poor Sabbath keeping was not their only problem. They were anxious for the Sabbath to be over, not because they were bored by it, but why? So they could get back to cheating people, right? And making that almighty dollar, as we say sometimes. Is it reasonable to think here that one sin can lead to another?
Absolutely. Dominoes.
The subject of Sabbath keeping, as I said before, is a subject of great balance. It's easy to get carried away in one direction or the other. And folks, the devil would love to help you do just that. Right? The devil would love to teach you how to be a legalist. You know what a legalist is? I get accused of it all the time, but that's not what I'm talking about. A legalist is somebody who does the right thing for the wrong reasons and has a begrudging spirit about it. Right? Right? Isn't that like the Pharisees in Jesus' day? He would love to teach you to be a legalist and therefore never understand the true rest of God. Now, Hebrews chapter 4 is not just talking about the Sabbath, it's talking about the true rest of God, which is your relationship with God. If you say true rest quickly, it kind of sounds like truest. If we keep the true rest of God, it will help us to be the truest followers and worshipers of God. Right?
Amen.
But you know what? If you say it just a little bit faster, true rest becomes truest, truest becomes trust. And really and truly, folks, the true rest that Hebrews 4 is speaking of is nothing more than a real trust in God. A real trust. It's the relationship of a perfect trust in our Heavenly Father. Now, one more thing I want to say about Sabbath keeping. And I hope this really abridged study lesson, if nothing else, will cause us to have conversations. Okay? The Sabbath is the fourth commandment. It's one of God's 10 commandments, right? So I want to remind you of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In Daniel chapter 3 and verse 17, they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king." And then in verse 18, they said, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden calf." Same difference though, right? Isn't it the same? "We will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." And last week or 2 weeks ago, we were talking about this very thing, weren't we? I really believe that it's always the negative to be dealt with is the paganism. Just like I believe the positive to be dealt with is Christ within the hope of glory. In every lesson. Okay? But I want to say this morning, be it known unto thee, world, that I'm not going to serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. If we break the Sabbath commandment, are we doing that? If we don't keep the Sabbath, honestly and earnestly. Is it any different? We're breaking a commandment, right? They were cast into the fiery furnace because they would not break one of God's commandments. So what does that say on their part? Haven't we been told that we're going to have to rather die than commit a known sin against God? My brain thinks of it a little bit differently. I'd rather die than commit treason against God's kingdom. If this is the sign that shows that God is my God and that I am His people, I mean, am I going too far? Or is that not really what it's saying? So would you die rather than break the Sabbath? That's the question, isn't it? I mean, that is the question. And I know we usually spiritualize all this stuff away. But is the day coming when we'll be brought before the rulers of the land?
That is the test.
And the Sabbath is the test. It is the great final test. We've already talked about that. Well, like I say, I hope if nothing else that this short lesson, and I know it wasn't short in time, but in material it's very, very short. I mean, there's so much more to say on the subject. So let's keep the conversation going, amen? Let's turn in our songbooks to number 388 and close by singing, "Remember the Sabbath."